Hello, and welcome to the BYU Family History Library webinar series. We're glad that you could join us today. I'm Marin, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Please make sure that your microphones and your web cameras are disabled during the presentation to provide a smooth webinar. During the webinar, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box, and I can address your concerns. You're welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments and insights. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our upcoming webinars are with Brandon Plew, who will be giving a presentation on Mormon places, and following that, we'll have a presentation with James Tanner on updates from MyHeritage. If you'd like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded for the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we're pleased to hear from Kathryn Grant, who will be giving a presentation on double trouble, avoiding the same name trap.
There we go. Okay, if anybody cannot see the screen, please let me know, but otherwise, we will go ahead. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. This is actually one of the topics that fascinates me the most and probably is one of the most valuable ones. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm currently a stake consultant. And so I work with a lot of different stake members, and this is actually one of the most common errors that I see when I'm working with people. That is that people, not necessarily the people I'm working with, but just users in Family Tree tend to confuse two people because they have some similar characteristics, but they turn out to be different people. So let's look at what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. First of all, we're going to, just to get us all on the same page, we're going to talk about what I mean when I refer to the same name trap. Second, we're going to go through a case study of the Frazer mystery child. I tend to learn a lot from case studies, and so that's why I'm using them in this webinar. I hope that you find them equally useful. We'll look at a second case study, Disappearing John, and finally, the case study of the Prolific Gowers. And then we'll wrap up with some tips for avoiding the same name trap. At the outset of the webinar, I wanted to set the context. So what I'm going to be speaking about today will specifically apply to working in FamilySearch Family Tree. So Family Tree is the area of the FamilySearch website where we're building the world pedigree. And the goal there is to have one complete accurate record for each person who's lived on the earth, linked to other records by correct relationships. So I just wanted to set that context before we get started. So what do I mean when I talk about the same name trap? Basically, it is the assumption that two different people in Family Tree are the same person usually because they have the same name, and sometimes they might have some other information in common. So let's take an example here. We've got John Chambers, who has a wife, Elizabeth. They live in England. And I find another John Chambers, and he also has a wife, Elizabeth, and they also live in England. So I might conclude, based on that evidence, that they are the same person. So suppose that we represent them with pictures of icebergs, and that you are asked to compare these two pictures and decide whether they represented the same iceberg. Well, looking at the two pictures, everything we can see looks pretty much the same, right? I look at those, I don't see really any difference at all. But if you know anything about icebergs, you know that generally most of the iceberg is below the surface and can't be seen. So let's imagine then that somebody gives us a picture of the icebergs where we can see what is below the surface. Well, then all of a sudden it becomes really obvious that John Chambers on the left and his wife Elizabeth and John Chambers on the right, they're not the same people. These icebergs are not the same. The part that's underneath the surface is completely different. So why does it matter? Why do we care about telling people with the same name apart when they're really different people? That might sound like an obvious question, but let's look at some of the impacts that that could have in family tree and on our doing family history. So when we confuse people with the same name, it can result in lost people in family tree. In other words, they get hidden because of a bad merge. A user concludes that they're the same people, so they merge them together. And so we see the surviving person right after the merge, but we can't see that person that got hidden underneath or inside the merged person who is really a separate person. And as you may have noticed in family tree, one bad merge tends to lead to more bad merges because the information gets corrupted. And then that ends up leading to duplicates because people look at somebody in family tree and say, oh, well, that's not this other John Chambers, for example, so I'd better add him in. So they add a duplicate in, not realizing that John Chambers was already in there, but that he got merged with the wrong John Chambers, if that makes sense. It really does turn into a bowl of spaghetti. Also, Family Tree relies on the information on the person page to generate record hints. So if there are bad merges, if we've confused two people, then it's very likely that we're going to get some incorrect record hints, which just compounds the problem because once those wrong hints are attached, they tend to pull other wrong hints from the system and people attach those and the problem just keeps getting worse and worse. And finally, entire incorrect family lines can be built because of two people being confused just because they have some similar information, but they're not really the same person. So let's dive into our case studies here. The first one is the case study of the Frazer mystery child. So I'd like to introduce you to William Frazer on my family line. William was born about 1846 in Norfolk, England. He married Mary Ann Rhodes in 1875 in the same location. And according to the 1911 census, they had 12 children. So I had worked on this family a few years ago, and I tried to, be pretty careful about it, and felt that I had found everybody that was in the family, and that it was accurate, and that it had been sourced correctly, and so forth. Well, one day I happened to go back. I don't even remember why at this point, but I looked at the family in Family Tree, and instead of the 12 children that I remembered, there were now 13. So my first thought was, wow, somebody found an extra missing child that I missed. This is so awesome. So I was really excited about it. And I looked at the person who was additional, and it was a woman by the name of Curtis Fraser, and she was added to the end of the children. So at first I thought, maybe she was born after the 1911 census, and someone else discovered her, and now we have this extra child in the family that we didn't know about. So I immediately set about trying to find some sources or prove who she was or whatever. So I opened up her person page, and this is what I saw. Now, if we were in a class, I would ask for people to raise their hands and say, what do you notice first off about this vital information? Well, pretty much the first thing we notice is there isn't any. So she has no birth, she has no christening. She just has the default deceased, which means that the system assumes she's been dead longer than 110 years, but it doesn't have a date, and we have no burial. So basically, we know pretty much nothing about this person except for her name, her sex, and the fact that the system assumes that she's already deceased. Well, whenever you find that in Family Tree, the next logical step is to try to look at any possible relationships. So we already question the parent relationship. We don't have proof for that yet, but let's see if she's got a spouse or any children. So I looked in the family section of her person page, and lo and behold, she's got a husband. His name is Abel Johnson. uh, Take a look when he died. So we can tell that that 1830 is a death date because it has the dash right in front of it. So we've got this woman supposedly born to this couple who got married in 1875, and she's got a husband who died in 1830. Something's not adding up. Well, it gets better. So Abel and Curtis apparently had a son born in 1783. So that is also not adding up very well. So as we look at these facts, it appears that William and Mary Ann Frazer, born in the mid-1800s, could not possibly have a daughter whose son was born in 1783. In other words, William and Mary Ann's grandson was born, according to Family Tree right now, or in this picture screenshot, was born, the grandson was born before the grandparents. Well, that's not going to happen, right?
How many videos do you have running? I had 2.
So, oh, on the recording, could we ask everybody to be sure and mute their audio? Thank you so much. So as I looked at this, I thought, well, at least I can try to clean things up a little bit. Maybe I could find out where Curtis belongs or who her parents really are. So the first thing I did was look at sources on the Family Tree person page. Guess what? There weren't any. So there weren't any sources for Curtis herself, and there weren't any sources for her husband or her son. Well, okay, sometimes we're maybe in a hurry and we don't attach sources in Family Tree, even though we hopefully will come back and attach them later on or at the time because sources are so helpful. But I thought at least I'll maybe go out to Ancestry, go to historical records, and see if I can find anything about this Abel Johnson who apparently married a Curtis Fraser, and they had a son named Abel Johnson. Well, guess what? No historical records found on any of the genealogical sites that I checked. There was simply no clue to this family at all. So I thought, I can, now I've got a choice to make. I can either keep working on this family, which I don't have a real strong reason to believe that they're part of my family line, or I could set it aside and move on to other things. And in my case, I decided to set it aside because, it's so easy to go down rabbit holes, right, when we're doing family history. And as much as I would have loved to prove this one way or the other, I thought at this point in time, my priorities are working on my family lines that I'm sure of rather than chasing a possible rabbit hole. And so I made the decision not to look at this any further, except the best we can do at this point is at least disconnect Curtis from the wrong family because we absolutely know that she is not the daughter of William and Mary Ann. So that was the resolution in this case. I just disconnected her from the family, tried to give a really good reason statement for why I felt she was not the child of William and Mary Ann, and then hopefully someday somebody will come along maybe who added that and will realize that they could add some extra information or whatever. One thing I did want to point out, I heard a really good saying once that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So you might ask, well, did that person really exist? Don't we know now that Curtis and her family probably didn't exist? Well, not exactly. Because what if the person who added to her and her husband got it from a family Bible that hasn't been digitized or found it on some website and they really are valid people? It's just that when I did the search, I wasn't able to find proof of that. So I left her in Family Tree, but disconnected from my family with the hopes that someday somebody will come along and be able to add more information and connect her to her right parents. Okay, let's move on to our next case study, which is the case study of disappearing John. So I'd like you to meet John Horridge. John is the son of James Horridge and Ellen Openshaw. John was born about 1844 in Bolton, Lancashire. I made a timeline grid on John, and the purpose, let me just do a little side note here. The purpose of the webinar, of course, this one is not to go into the timeline grid, but just briefly, you can kind of see from the example on the screen that we've got one column for every census and we've got one row for the people we're concerned about. So we've got James the dad in the top row. We've got Ellen the mom in the second row. By 1871, Ellen has died, unfortunately, and John has remarried to a woman named Betty, but John is with them the whole time, and you can see his age stays consistent. His birthplace is consistent in two censuses. He lists Brightmet in the 1871, and so I checked into that just to see if that was a possible issue. Well, it turns out that Brightmet is actually a neighborhood within Bolton. So then I felt good about that. Everything else lined up. But after 1871, I could find no clue whatsoever about John. And in Family Tree, he had no spouse and children. And so I'd been working with actually a stake member on this. And one day we went into Family Tree, come to find out that somebody had added a wife and children to John. And again, we were really excited. My stake member and I, we thought, oh my goodness, we have been looking for this guy past the 1871 census. We've had no luck finding him. Probably, hopefully, somebody has, found a census that we couldn't find and has put his family together. And how exciting is this? Because it'll just open up the rest of the family line. But let's go ahead and verify it. So we looked at the census and found this John Horridge. Unfortunately, let me back up here a second. One great thing about this family is that Carletta is a pretty unusual name, particularly in England where this family lived. So I figured if I could find a John and a Betty with a Carletta and an Ella, that's got to be the right family. So we found them in the 1891 census. But then we started noticing some little discrepancies. First of all, this John Horridge was born. Oh, and for those of you who may be wondering, in England, JNO was used as an abbreviation for John or Jonathan. So we looked at his birth date. Well, it was off by 3 years. In a census, I might expect someone to be off, their birth year to be off by maybe 1 or 2 years. But once it gets 3, 4, 5, I start to get a little concerned that that may not be the same person. And we discover that he's born in Prestwich, Lancashire, not Brightmet or Bolton. So I looked on Google, and Prestwich is about 10 miles away. Not completely unlikely, but still in the census, he never said Prestwich, and it is a little bit of a distance away. Well, another thing that can help us is occupations. So I brought up this census and looked at John's occupation, come to discover that he's a stockkeeper in the cotton trade. Well, that's a pretty far cry from being a coal miner. And a lot of times, once you got into a coal mine, worked as a miner, you did it because you didn't have an education, and it was pretty much you got there and you stayed there. It wasn't easy to get out of that if that's how you'd chosen to support your family. And so this is another kind of red flag that this might not be the right family. Now, the true proof is going to come. You remember, we found our John in the 1871. Can we find John and Betty and Carletta? I don't remember off the top of my head who would be alive in the 71, but can we find this family in the 71? And if we can, and they're separate from our John, then we have absolute proof that these are two different families. Well, that is indeed what we found. In fact, you remember probably from Family Tree that Betty's maiden name is Yates. And so here we have John Harry, they said Harridge, and that's just American, right? In England, H-A-R and H-O-R with the British accent would be pronounced very much the same. So we have John Harridge living here with his wife Betty and with poor Carnetta, who's really Carletta. Her name probably got mixed up all over the place because it's unusual, but it's such a pretty name. But this is definitely them. And so we can see that because they're in a separate place in the 1871 census, and our guy is living with his dad, stepmom, and actually his stepbrother, then we know that these are two separate families. And so the next step is to find out who was this John Horridge right up here, who was he intended to be? When he was added to the system, was he intended to be the son of James and Ellen, or was he intended to be the husband of Betty and Carletta? And usually you can tell that by going into the change log. We won't go into a lot of detail just in the interest of time, but if you want to learn more about the change log, there's a webinar about it on the BYU Family History Webinar webpage. So just look for change log and you'll get a webinar that explains it in detail. But suffice it to say that normally you can go into the change log and you can kind of tell when somebody was added, who they were first connected to, and so who somebody intended them to be. And in this case, it became clear that John was intended to be the son of James and Ellen, and it was only later that Betty was connected to him with the children. So in this case, the resolution was to disconnect Betty and her children from our John, get her connected to her right husband, and then continue looking for our John after 1871. And this does have a happy ending. Eventually, actually, it was thanks to my sweet dad who did some searching and found John after 1871. We hadn't been able to find him, and Dad did. So we were able to trace him farther through the census. He actually married a woman named Nancy, and they had some kids. So that was the resolution to disappearing John. And now we're ready to tackle our last case study, which is the case of the Prolific Gowers. So I'd like you to meet William Gower and Sarah Ann Gaisley. If this were true, Sarah Ann would deserve automatic salvation in heaven for being the mother of 20 children. Now, it's not impossible that she should have 20, but it's kind of unlikely. So when I looked at this with another different stake member, we thought let's check this out and just make sure that this poor woman really did have 20 children, and not to ignore William, because he would have been responsible in that time period for supporting this entire family of 20 children, while Sarah tended them at home and was apparently pregnant for most of her life. Well, let's take a look though and see if these children really do all belong in the family. At first, I just started clicking on the kids to, see the summary card, and my head started spinning. And I thought, I have got to put this in a table of some kind, so I can make sense of it. So this is what I found. And obviously, this isn't all 20 children, but it's enough for you to see the pattern. The first child in Family Tree is born and christened in Essex. The second child pops across the island to the county of Shropshire. The next child is born in Worcestershire, just kind of below Shropshire. But then all of a sudden, we're back in Essex across the island again. Now we're in Shropshire. Now we're back in Worcestershire. Back in those days, for one thing, people rarely moved from their home parish, especially if they were poor, as this family was. If they did something like mining or agricultural laboring, they pretty much stayed in the same parish. They might move 5 or 10 miles away, but very likely they stayed within 10 miles of where they were born. If they ended up moving, they definitely didn't cycle through counties one after the other, going back and forth, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it looks like we're probably dealing with 3 different families. And I kind of color coded them here. So on the right-hand side, you can see these kids. And again, this isn't all 20, but it will show you the pattern that we see in them. So we've got these kids over here who were born in Essex. Then we've got the kids that I've put in purple who were born in Oh, I always get them mixed up. They're born in Shropshire. And then the kids indicated in green are born in Worcestershire, the next county down. So it kind of, and you notice that the dates all work within the groups in the counties. So these dates are all logical for single families. And so this is making it pretty obvious that at least 3 families have been mixed together. And as it turned out, the more we dug into it, as I recall, there were actually 4 families that had been mixed together. And the reason they were is that somebody took a William Gower with a wife of Sarah, and they found William and thought, oh, if it's William Gower, and actually sometimes it was even Gowan, and if it's William with a wife of Sarah, they must be the same person. So they had merged these 4 families together, which resulted in our William and Sarah having 20 children, but they actually did not have 20 children. So the resolution in this case was, first of all, to undo quite a few bad merges for William Gower and for Sarah, and then to disconnect the wrong children from the wrong couples and get them added to the right couples. And when that happened, the families were much more reasonably sized. They, as I recall, they ranged from something like 6 to 10 children, which was a lot easier on the parents than 20 and a lot more realistic. So, what are some tips for avoiding the same name trap? One thing is to be aware that in some families, the same name is often used repeatedly, both within and across generations. I remember one time finding an Emma, I believe it was one of my Bescabies, finding an Emma who was born 6 months apart from her cousin with the same name in the same location. The only way I could tell those 2 sweet girls apart was by their parents, because pretty much everything else lined up. So we have to be careful and not just jump to a conclusion that because somebody has the same name, they're the same person. We've got to look at other data. As you can see down here, these are not exact, but you can tell. Um, for instance, look at this John Bescaby, born in 42. Well, this one's clearly different than the other John Bescaby, judging by their avatars, right? But as you look at this, you can see that if we just went by the name or even just the name and birth year, we're setting ourselves up for mistakes, for the possibility of mistakes and the possibility of mixing these people up. So here are some tips for avoiding the same name trap. One is to watch for factual inconsistencies, such as different birth years and places or different occupations. So here's an example. If we just looked at this information, say it's from a christening record, we might conclude that these 2 families represent the same family. But when we look a little deeper, we find that one Edward is a constable, the other is a cotton weaver. One mother's maiden name is Espen, another's mother's maiden name is Stuffin. One John was born in 42 in Lancashire, another was born in 47 in Lincolnshire. And so from these facts, it becomes easy to see that we're talking about 2 different families here. So watch for those factual inconsistencies. Also watch for source inconsistencies, mismatched number of children, or different mothers' maiden names. We saw an example of this with the Frazer mystery, and that was that according to the 1911 census, the family had 12 children. Suddenly there were 13 in family tree, so that was kind of a red flag to us to at least check it out. Then another tip for avoiding the same name trap is to watch for logical inconsistencies. We also saw that in the Fraser case study, where we had William that was born in 46, a supposed daughter with no birth date, but that daughter had a son who was born before his grandfather. So when you watch for those logical inconsistencies, that can help you tell people apart who have the same names. The last one is to take some time to get to know the family. And the best way for me to do that, honestly, is to use this little tool called the timeline grid. Now, it's best for countries and time periods that have regular censuses. It doesn't really work that well for instance, in England, the first useful census is 1841, and before that, you use church records like christenings and marriages and burials. It honestly doesn't work very well for before 1841, although making a little table such as we saw for the Gowers could be a way to get to know the family. For instance, if you listed all the children in order by christening. But if you do happen to be working in a time period in a country where the census is used, this little table can really help you get to know your family, get all the facts straight, and help you to avoid confusing the members of this family with the members of another family. If you're interested in more information, we do have webinars on this tool called the Timeline Grid, and you can also go to this page, which is tinyurl.com/timeline-grid, and there's more information and free templates on that page. So that brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. And let's just look over our brief summary. The same name trap is thinking or assuming that two people with the same name are the same person when they aren't. And we looked at 3 case studies, and then we went over tips for avoiding the same name trap. So that brings us to the end of our webinar, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And let's go ahead. I believe that I can stop a share here, and get back to chatting. And I would invite you, if you have any questions, to enter them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them. Oh, that is a really good question. How do you disconnect somebody? If you imagine with me the person page in Family Tree, and imagine that we're down in the family section, and you've got the spouses and oh, thank you, Maren. You've got the spouses and you've got the children down there. On the right-hand side of the spouses and on the right-hand side of the children, you will see what looks like a little pencil icon. If you click that pencil icon, you will have the ability to either remove the relationship completely or to remove whoever's incorrect and replace them with the correct person. Thank you very much for that great question. And Maria, thank you for your kind comment. And we'll hang on here a few more moments for any other questions.